There are a lot of amazing code editors available. Most are free and come with rich features and thriving communities. The editor I'll recommend for you for this course has become a favorite among developers worldwide. And just as promised, it's free and comes with an incredible set of features and a vibrant community. So point your browser to code.visualstudio.com, and from the homepage, you'll see a download button right there. Now, I'm on a Windows machine, but this will point to a Mac or Linux installer depending on the type of machine that you're on. So go ahead and download and install VS Code, and then I'll show you a tool that will make your life so much easier. So here I have VS Code installed and opened up. And what's great about VS Code is that it supports extensions. So if you take a look at the icon bar on the left, you'll see an icon that shows a box being snapped into another box. Well, if you click on this, it opens up VS Code's extensions window. Extensions are a great feature because that means that anyone can create additional functionality to VS Code, and it supports all kinds of extra features. So let's install an extension that opens up your code in a web browser in the same way a web server sends your pages to the browser. But you don't have to write any server-related code. And the best part is that it listens for changes as you make them and automatically refreshes the window with your latest changes. It's pretty handy. So in the search box, we'll search for Live Server. From here, we'll click Install, and then for this extension, we'll reload the VS Code window. So within VS Code, we'll type Control-Shift or Command-Shift-P, and it shows that I've recently done this, but if you start typing Reload Window, that option shows up for you underneath the search bar. So we'll press Enter, and now you can see down at the bottom of the window, we have a Go Live button. All right, let's test this out. VS Code comes with some shortcuts that make it a little bit easier to write some HTML. So I'll start writing HTML, and you see that I have some options that drop down here. I'll select the one where it has :5, and then just down in the body, I'll type in Hello World again. From there, I'll save my changes, and then I can go over to the Explorer, right-click on the file, and say Open with Live Server. This launches the live server, and now my page is showing up within the browser window. And now watch this. Anytime I make a change to this file and press save, it automatically makes that change over in the browser. So now that Visual Studio Code is set up on your machine, we can set up the sample project on your machine as well. Hello and welcome to Building Websites with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, Getting Started. I'm really excited because you're about to take your first steps into becoming a web developer. Building websites requires a bit of knowledge among a number of different disciplines. And starting today, you begin learning about each of these building blocks step by step. You learn about how HTML is used to structure your site's content, how style sheets craft the look and feel of your site, and all about the web's programming language, JavaScript, which adds behavior and interactivity to your site. By the end of this course, you learn to build a website that rests firmly on these foundations, touches on some advanced browser features, and works just as well on mobile devices as it does on the desktop. Well, I'm Craig Shoemaker, and I'm delighted to teach you all about building websites with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Let's get started. Your close friend Bethany has a thriving local business selling what you consider to be the best pies ever baked. So when she mentioned that she wanted some help to take her pie shop online, well, you jump at the chance to help make her dream a reality. The homepage welcomes customers with a warm greeting and an invitation to dive into her selection of pies. By clicking on the Browse Our Pies link, a collection of available pies is listed on the page. From here, you have a chance to order Bethany's famous apple pie or the ever-popular cherry pie. Clicking on one of the order buttons takes us to the order page where the website asks for permission to read location data. And then from there, we can enter in our name, address, and any comments we want to share with Bethany. Now, before we send the order over, there's something happening inside the browser that I want you to see. I've opened up the browser developer tools, and now we can get an idea of how the information is saved in the browser to power our pies order page. Now, we'll get into the details of how all this works soon, but I want you to have a little bit of an understanding of what's happening behind the scenes. So if we go back to the order form, when we submit the form, all of the order information is sent to the server for processing. Now, since this course covers front-end technologies, meaning the code that runs inside the browser and not on the web server, when we submit the form, I just have a utility running on my machine that displays that information back to us. So we can be sure we're sending all the information exactly as it needs to go to the server. So we've got a lot of ground to cover. We'll talk about HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and everything needed in order to build this website from a blank page. So to get you started in the right direction, let's start by writing your first bit of HTML. In this module, you learn all about what HTML is, about its purpose, and how it interacts with different parts of a website. You'll become familiar with common elements and learn how search engines see a web page, as well as find out how to validate HTML code on your site. So, to begin, let's find out what HTML stands for and what it really is. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. Now, let's take that step by step. Hypertext is really one word, and it refers to the fact that on the web, documents are linked together using what's called a hyperlink. Now, taking the prefix hyper out of the equation for a moment, what we're really saying is that there are text documents that are connected together by links. And this is the foundation of the web. You might wonder then, why is hyper a part of the name? Well, hyper is used in the sense of making things bigger, like hyperspace, rather than what you think of when you hear the term like hyperactive. So as you navigate from one website to the next, they're all tied together through a series of links, which conceptually web together, giving us the name, the web, for the internet. Now, markup language refers to the code that we write in order to create the documents, and in many cases, that establishes links between these documents. Now, the building block for the markup language are what's called HTML elements. So let's zoom in a bit and take a look at what an element is. Returning back to the simple web page example, when we look at the page's HTML, you can see that it's made up of different elements. Now, if we take a look at these elements just a little bit closer for the moment, you'll see that each element is made up from at least two parts. The first part is what's called a tag. While every page is made up of building blocks, which are the elements, each element is differentiated by its tag. An element's tag tells you what the element is and the different roles that it plays on the page. We'll dive into those roles and meanings in a moment, but for now, when we look at this page, you can see that it's built from a series of elements where each one has its tag: HTML, head, title, body, H1, P, and IMG for images. Okay, let's look at the image element just a little bit closer. This element has the IMG tag, but it also has some additional information associated with it. The source and title parts of the element are what's known as attributes. Now this makes sense because if I wanted to describe myself to someone, I might say I'm a person, which equates to the element's tag, and I might say that my name is Craig and I have brown eyes and brown hair, and these are all attributes of who I am as a person. In similar fashion, the image element, which has the IMG tag, includes the source and title attributes. Now, different attributes do different things. In the case of the image element, the source attribute tells the web browser where to look on the server for an image file. This way, if the image can be found by the browser, it knows how to display it on the screen. The title attribute gives us a title or a bit of description about the element. Notice how when I hover over the image, the title appears, and the title attribute makes this possible. So HTML pages are made up from a series of building blocks called elements. Each element is identified by its tag, and an element can have 0, 1, or many attributes. Now, throughout the course, you're going to see a couple attributes over and over again: the ID attribute and the class attribute. ID stands for identifier, and that will give a unique name to elements on the page. The class attribute can be used to identify an element and change how the element looks on the page using style sheets. And again, we'll get into that a lot more as the course goes on. But for now, you have a much better idea of the difference between elements, tags, and attributes. So now let's look at how to use some common elements. Now, the way a browser represents a web page in memory is through the document object model. Now, if we talk about the document, every website is made up of a collection of web pages. Every web page is a single document. And inside the web browser, each page is represented by something in memory, which is called document. If we go back to our really simple website and open up the developer tools, I'll right click and choose inspect, and then come over to the console. The console is a place where I can write different commands, and the browser will tell me what the result is. So in here, I can type in document. And when I press enter, you'll notice that it returns to me a reference to the document within the browser. Now, when I hover over it, it highlights the entire page. If I expand this item, you can see here that all of the HTML, essentially everything that you see within the Elements tab of the developer tools, is available through document. So the document object is what the browser uses to understand the web page as a whole. Now, I keep talking about this word object. In the world of computers, we have to find ways to make representations of things that exist either in the real world or just while the computer is working with something. One way to think about an object is that it's an approximation of something. For instance, if I ask you to think about a house, you probably think of walls and a roof and some windows and a door, but houses are really so much more than that. They're heating and cooling systems and plumbing and electrical systems and paint and on and on. The point is that we think in terms of abstractions, meaning we often use placeholders for things that we either don't want to be bothered with the details of or things we don't understand at all. In the browser, each element is represented by an object, which is a way the browser uses to understand the structure created by the elements on a web page. Now, when we talk about model, this alludes to the fact that the DOM is a representation of that structure. Just like a model plane is a representation of the real thing, here we're using a series of objects in order to create a model of what really exists on the web page. So the browser uses the document object model to understand, represent, and interface with the web page. You'll often see it reduced to the acronym of DOM, which is pronounced DOM. So if you like, the DOM is a tree structure that represents the hierarchical nature of the structure of a web page. And looking back at our simple web page, you can see this hierarchy and how the page is represented in memory. Now, what gets fun here is that if you poke around a little bit, you'll notice over on the Elements tab, as I select different elements, this little gray $0 follows me around for any element that I select. So with this paragraph selected, if I go over to the console and type in $0, it returns a reference to that element. So if I go back over to Elements and I select the header, the H1, and I do the same thing, type in $0, it returns a reference to the header. So this is a shortcut that the browser gives you in order to work with the DOM. Every time I select an element, it creates a little pointer to the selected item that you can access using $0. So what you're seeing here as we poke around a little bit is how the document is represented in the browser's memory. It just so happens that the model is rendered to us in the exact same markup we typed into the editor. Now, we'll spend a good amount of time in the developer tools using the DOM. So this is how the browser sees the web page. But how does a search engine see the web page when it reads its contents? Well, we'll look at that next. Now, search engines see your web page differently than you do in the web browser. So we're just warming up to some of these concepts, and I want to state up front that I'm simplifying things a lot in an attempt to make this easy to understand from the very basics. There's an entire art and science involved with working with and ranking in search engines. I'm going to sidestep all of that for a moment and just look at the very small slice of search engine functionality of what the search engine does when it looks at your web page. So it's a good time to introduce a new term, semantic markup. Semantic markup doesn't use any special HTML elements, but it more refers to how you use the elements together. Let's look at this HTML fragment. Introduction. Once upon a time, there was a beautiful princess who lived happily ever after. This is a short bedtime story I tell my daughter from time to time when it's too late to tell a real story. Well, as far as the HTML is concerned, there's a problem with this structure. There's no way to tell the relative significance of one piece of content from the next. What I mean by that is that a computer can't tell that the word introduction is a title and that it has a nuanced meaning that's different from the text that's in the paragraph tag. So if we transform the markup a little bit to something like this, now the introduction is within an H1 tag saying that it's a page header, and we have the story in the paragraph tag. Even this slight change makes a significant difference in terms of how a search engine sees the page. Instead of the introduction hiding anonymously in a simple P element, a computer can tell that the H1 element is a title on the page, and not just any title, but the first title. And in this context, it means the primary title and the most important one. Search engines use all kinds of different criteria to determine what shows up in the rankings. And again, I'm not even remotely touching on those concepts. All I want to express to you right now is that the type of tag you wrap your content in makes a big difference on how search engines see your page. So content in an H1 element is more important to a search engine than content in an H2 element because H1 is the primary title of the page. Just like the content in the main element is treated differently like the content in an aside element, the main element signals to the search engine this content is important, while what's inside an aside is extra content that isn't the core of the message of the page. So writing semantic markup means that you're familiar with the purpose of the tags that you use for each element on the page. And if you remember that reference I showed you just a little bit ago, the meaning and purpose of each element is well documented. Now, the best way to learn these nuances is to spend time becoming acquainted with the elements and find out what sort of content they're most appropriate for. Yeah, there's a lot there, and you don't have to know all the tags and the attributes just to get started. We're going to take it slow and just do one element at a time. So now I want to talk about one more topic before we move on to the next module. And that's how you know the HTML you write is correct. So markup validation is next. Now, as you write HTML, one of the things that you want to know is whether or not the code that you create is valid. So if we return back to our simple web page and take a look at the underlying HTML, we can take the markup for this page and give it to a validation service, and it'll let us know whether or not we're following the rules of HTML correctly. So here, I'll copy the code and take it over to validator.w3.org. The W3C is an organization that's responsible for directing HTML. And here they make a validation service available to you so you can check your code. Now, there's a couple different methods you can use. You can give it a URL, you can upload a file, but we'll use the direct input method. Here I can paste in my code from my page and click on check. And as we scroll down to the results, you can see that the validator returns back some feedback about the code for the page. So here you'll notice that I'm missing the language attribute for my HTML element, and that it's also looking for a doc type element at the very start of the page. So as you write more and more HTML and you're looking to see if you're following the rules correctly, you can go over to validator.w3.org and find out. Now that you've seen how to validate your code, let's look at the different pieces, the different building blocks of a web page, and find out the difference between HTML, styling with CSS, and logic with JavaScript. When you look into the browser, you see a web page that's made up of text and images and video and a number of different interactive elements. And when you see all those pieces put together in a refined way, you're seeing the final product of a series of different technologies that are put together in just the right way to present to you what's called the user interface. Now, that user interface is a web page that's put together through HTML, what's called a style sheet, and a scripting language called JavaScript. Let's break these down by thinking about the different aspects of how it relates to a person. When you see a person, often one of the first things that you notice about them is their physical appearance. That physical appearance is how you interact with people on a daily basis. And people look a lot different depending on their bone structure and the clothes they decide to wear each day. So if we were to equate a person's skeletal system to the structure that's found within their body, that's the same thing as HTML within a web page. As you create markup around content, you're creating a structure for the page. Now, by itself, like you saw in our original example, really isn't much to look at. It's just pieces of information that are thrown on the page. And so you need another layer of technology that's responsible for what we call the style. So when you think of style, or in our example, a person's clothes, that's made possible through cascading style sheets. So HTML provides the structure, cascading style sheets provide the style or the look and the feel, and lastly, no person is complete without what truly makes them unique, and that's their brain. The brain is where a person's thought and logic and reasoning happens. And while our web pages aren't quite that advanced, the brain represents the programming and the business rules and the logic that we build in to our web applications. And this is handled through JavaScript. So when HTML gives you structure, CSS gives you style, and JavaScript brings you interactivity, together you have a fully functioning website. So now with this context, in the next module, we'll start looking at cascading style sheets and how you can add style to your websites. So now that you're a little more familiar with what HTML is and its purpose, next we'll look at adding style with cascading style sheets in order to make that raw HTML look just a little bit better. Beyond just looks, we'll explore how different types of style sheet rules are applied to different devices in order to create a website that responds differently to desktop browsers as it does to mobile devices. So now you've written a little bit of code, you've set up the editor Visual Studio Code on your machine, and you've got the project files ready to go. Now let's move on towards building your very first web page. Now with VS Code set up on your machine, we can go ahead and get the starting files that you need in order to work with this course. Now all the code is available up on GitHub under github.com/CraigShoemaker/HTML, CSS, JavaScript, getting started. Now, if you're not familiar with GitHub and how it works, no worries, I've got you covered. I just want you to know that all the code is here. And in fact, I even have something special set aside for you, which makes getting started very easy. If you go to this address, bit.ly/hcj-start, that will automatically point to a file and allow you to download a zip that has all the starting files that you need for this course. So let's go ahead and do that. Now the zip file is downloaded to my machine. If I type Control-J in the browser, that shows the file that I just downloaded. I can click Show in Folder, and that takes me directly to the folder that it was saved in. From there, I can right-click and choose Extract All. Then I can open up the folder that it created, and here's all the starting files. From here, I can copy the file location, go back to Visual Studio Code, select File, Open Folder, paste in that location. And now you can see that the images for our website, as well as placeholders for all the HTML files, are all available here within these starter files. So now with everything set up, in the next module, we'll begin writing your first page in the website. Okay, let's get started. Open up your browser and make your way over to codepen.io/pen. From here, we'll expand the HTML pane and enter in open bracket H1 close bracket. This is your first HTML element. The H stands for header, and 1 means that it's the primary or first header on the page. Now there's a lot packed into the significance of this element, but for now, suffice it to say that the H1 header is essentially the title of your page. Next, let's add some text. Hello world. Now, as the story goes, an old programming book from the 70s first used Hello World to show the simplest possible program in a given language. So if you continue on in programming, you'll probably see this quite a bit. So now to finish off the element, we'll add what's called the closing tag. And there it is. You've written your first bit of HTML. It's too soon to call it a web page, but we're getting there. So from this tiny example, you can start to see that websites are made up of elements that when they're stacked together in just the right way, they make up the foundation of the web. Now let's lean into this a little bit and get a few tools set up on your machine so you can start writing something that more resembles what you'll make in the real world. So next up, you'll install a code editor named Visual Studio Code, along with a handy tool that makes it easy to see your code as it changes. Now that you have the sense of what role HTML plays, let's talk about HTML elements. An element is a building block of a web page. Much like a Lego brick is the building block of this town here, HTML elements are put together in order to build the structure of a web page. All right, well, let's take a look at it in the sense of a very simple website. Now, from this web page, we have a few options available to us in order to look at the underlying code. First, we can right-click on the page and select View Source. This opens a new tab with the HTML of the page. It's okay, and it works all right for a very small web page like this one, but once you move on to a real website, things can change just a little bit. For a more real-world example, let's take a look at Pluralsight.com. And we'll right-click and choose View Page Source. And as we scroll here a little bit, you can see that quickly things get a little bit indecipherable. So let's close this out and try a different way. This time, instead of right-clicking and choosing View Source, I'm going to select Inspect. This opens up the Elements pane of the browser developer tools. You'll get to know these tools quite well during this course. From here, you get a better sense of the page. The elements are collapsible. And even on a very, very big page, I can scroll up to the top and get a sense of the structure of what's happening within this web page. Now I can hover over an element and select one, and what you see here is commonly called markup. And depending on what I select, if I hover over an element, it will highlight it in the page itself. So every HTML page is made up of a series of HTML elements that build on one another like a series of bricks that, when set together just right, make a house. So let's find out what makes each element different. Now, when I talk about there being building blocks for a web page, there are many blocks to choose from. Here I am on the HTML elements reference on the Mozilla Developers Network, and the MDM web docs are the place to go when you want to learn about HTML elements and web APIs. Now, I won't go over each one of the elements, but on this page, you can find all you need to know about each element that's available to you in HTML5. So every page will start off with an HTML element. Usually there's a head element in there as well, along with a body element. And you've seen these in the examples that I've shown you so far. But then things start to get a little more granular. So there's content sectioning elements, elements specifically for text content, elements for inline text. And what we mean by semantics here is by using elements that describe information about the text that's within a web page. We'll get into this more as we go along. Image and multimedia elements, embedded content. These are for a few of your more advanced scenarios. Scripting, which you'll get familiar with in this course. Ways of showing edits, presenting tabular information, web forms, the way that you're going to collect user data, elements that allow you to interact with the page, web components that give you the chance to create custom elements, and then, of course, the elements that we no longer support on the web. So as you journey through learning about HTML, this reference can be very useful to you. All right, now let's use some of these elements on a page. Now, along the way, I'd like to introduce you to my friend Emmet. And Emmet is a tool that's built into Visual Studio Code that makes it so much easier for you to write HTML code. Emmet is made out of shortcuts, so I can type a few characters, press the Tab key, and it'll fill in the rest for me. So here I want to start off by building the basics that I need for an HTML5 page. So here I'll type HT, and you can see the autocomplete even comes up, and I want an HTML5 page, so I can select HTML:5, and this creates a stub for the HTML page for me. Now, within the body of the page, I can simply type H1. And when I hit Tab, that creates an H1 element for me. And it even positions my cursor between the two elements so I can start typing something that's wrapped around by that element. So here, I'll give the page a title. On the next line, I want to add a paragraph to the page. So I can type P and press Tab. And this creates a paragraph element. And now I can give the paragraph some text. Now I want to create a link on my page. To do that, I'll use the anchor tag. Now, instead of typing out anchor, we've abbreviated it to just A, so I can create an A element, hit Tab, and this time, instead of just creating the element, it gives me an attribute as well. Now, the href attribute stands for hyperlink reference. So what that means is that I can put a web address in there, and my link will point to that address when I click on it. So here, let's create a link to Pluralsight. And now in between the opening and closing tag of the element, I can add some text. Now I want to add a table. With Emmet's help, that becomes very easy. I can just type table. That creates the root table element. Now I'm going to create a header for the table. The abbreviation for that is T-head for table head. Inside that header, I'd like to create a row. So this is the header row of the table. The row is a TR element for table row. And inside that row, I want to create a header. So I'll do TH for header, and I'll give this a label of author. The next thing I'll do is create a title header because we're creating a list of courses that you can find over on Pluralsight. So that's the header of the table, and now I can create the body of the table. Within the body, I want to have a row, and within that row, I need some table data. So the element for this is TD. So I can type in an author name like Craig Shoemaker. I'll create some more table data and paste in one of my course titles, like the one you're watching right now. Now, it's not much of a table if it doesn't have at least another row of data, so I'll create another row, another cell for data, type in another Pluralsight author. Let's go with John Papa. One more cell of data, and we'll point to his latest course, View Getting Started. So now let's take a look at the result of this page. I'll right-click on the page and come down and say Open with Live Server. Well, here's our page, and yes, it is not much to look at. We'll get into styling the page in a moment, but here we've got a title on the page. We've got some paragraph worth of text and a table that desperately needs some styling to make it look better. But nevertheless, it's a table. And we have our link to when we click on it, we can learn more at Pluralsight. Next, let's look at how a web browser uses this structure to create a version of the web page that it builds in memory and see how it uses this model to interact with the page.